Welcome to the Rector's Forum at All Saints Church. My name is Mike Kinman. As coincidence would have it, I am the rector. And my pronouns are he, him, and it is wonderful to have everybody here. Want to welcome everyone who is streaming us online. If you can turn and wave to the camera, say hi. Not everyone's turning. Some of you are doing this, and waving. Say hi. It's wonderful to have you all here wherever you are. And want to let people know some of the important information. We have coffee and tea and water over here. The bathrooms are around the corner here. The exits are there and there. If you're streaming from home, I'll trust you to find your own stuff. You know where it is. It is wonderful to have everybody here. And if you're new or visiting us this morning, would like to know about future events at All Saints Church, we have green contact sheets near both doors. Please take a moment just to give us your contact information so we can be in touch with you and help you learn more about the All Saints community and get connected here. Also at the welcome table on the lawn, you can pick up a red welcome bag that includes a welcome card and lots of information about everything going on here at All Saints Church. Also, if you'd like to know more about our LGBTQ ministries, today is International Transgender Day of Visibility, and we also have this table over here, which currently nobody is at, but at the end, we'll have a couple members of our LGBTQ ministry at that table. There's flyers there, and you can talk to them who can answer any questions and get you hooked up with that. While you're there, that's also functioning as our action table. We believe at putting our faith into action at all times here at All Saints Church, and every week we pick one thing to focus that action. This week we are inviting everyone to sign on to a letter of condolence and support to the mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand for the anti-Islamic, anti-immigrant acts of terrorism that they suffered a couple weeks ago. And so there's a letter that you can sign on to. We also have pieces of paper where you can write your own message of condolence, and we're going to be putting those all in a book and sending those off to New Zealand. So please do that, and please continue to keep the people of New Zealand and keep all of our siblings of many different faiths who are suffering terrorism and persecution and discrimination in your prayers. And let's continue to look how we can reach out across those differences and through many commonalities that we have in faith. So please step to the action table and sign that letter. We appreciate deeply the generous giving that occurs in this congregation and around the world. If you've made your pledge to All Saints Church for 2019, thank you so much for doing that. If you haven't yet, there is still time. And I'll be saying that in December. There's still time. And so please do that. We have pledge cards in the pews. You can see me. You can see Mary Ann Ryan. That's part of how we keep this church thriving, along with the Holy Spirit's presence and the labor of so many people. And if you're online, it's super easy. There's a big donate button just below where you're watching right now. So just go down here and click. And you can give or it'll take you to a pledge card. I am absolutely thrilled this morning to have with us in the forum Louise Siskel. Louise is a senior at Sequoia High School, which is a pretty cool place. She is, you probably know her best as the 2019 Rose Queen. And yes. And I don't want to give away too much in an introduction. What has gotten you famous as if being the Rose Queen isn't enough is you're a bunch of firsts. You were the first openly LGBTQ Rose Queen, the first Jewish Rose Queen, and the one that blew me away is the first Rose Queen to wear glasses on the float. Which I appreciate. I'm so thrilled that you said yes to come here and just talk about your journey and sort of what's all this been like. And I just want to start off with something really basic. Like, how do you get to be Rose Queen? Like what? And what made you say, hey, that's something I want to explore?
Yeah. So, hi everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really excited to be here with all of you and recognize many familiar faces in the audience. I first began the process of becoming Rose Queen probably in just before October, so September. And the way you become Rose Queen is you go through 4 interview rounds. The first is very short. You simply say why you want to be on the royal court. It's 15, 20 seconds long. I said something about how I was excited about the tradition. I wanted to be part of a long legacy of really committed and passionate young women, and how that was something that was important to me and an exciting opportunity. And then from there, they continue to make the pool smaller and smaller as each interview round goes on. It ultimately ended up with 44 young women after, and then they announced the royal court, which is 7 young women on the steps of the tournament house. And that's at the beginning of October. And then the royal court is selected for that year. And then about a month later, at the end of October, they choose the Rose Queen. They spend a month getting to know you. You go on a weekend trip away together. And you spend a lot of time with the committee, which is composed of probably 12 or 13 members. And then they ultimately select the Rose Queen for that year.
Wow, so like you're starting your senior year in September, and like none of this is like on your radar screen.
No, and actually the Tournament of Roses wasn't really on my radar either. I actually have a friend who goes to Sequoia with me, and his grandmother was very excited about the Tournament of Roses. And so she said I had to try out. I tried out with one of my other friends because when you try out, you get free tickets to the Royal Ball. And so I tried out on a bit of a lark, and I took my 3 best friends to the Royal Ball. And then once I got to the end of those 4 interview rounds, I realized that this is actually something that I might be spending the next few months doing. And I had to think about why this tradition was meaningful and why this was an opportunity that I was excited about or felt was worthwhile. And I think what I thought of was that this opportunity gives you a public platform in a way that you don't often have as a young woman. It can be difficult to grow up as a young woman where your opinions and your voice are often ignored or dismissed, and I think that's a common experience that many young people share. But the Royal Court gives 7 young women each year the opportunity to speak to your community, to share a message that you deeply believe in. And so I think that was the opportunity that I thought was really exciting.
Wow, and so you go from just sort of like starting your senior year, like looking where you're going to go to college, your senior project, like, which is like, that's big enough. And then all of a sudden, you have this platform, and people are looking to you, and then it's also like, well, you're all these firsts. And so you're like on the front page of the LA Times, or, and it just is. And so what has that experience been like for you, just really the suddenness of this shift for you?
I would say I was attracted to the public platform from the beginning. I thought it was an exciting opportunity. But when I first was selected, I didn't really know what I wanted to say. And I think that's a common experience that the other girls on the court had as well. We were interested in speaking to our community about things we cared about, but we didn't know what we would say to people. And I think the message that I first developed was scientific literacy. I'm interested in becoming a scientist, and so I wanted to talk about responsible science informing public policy. And I began my Rose Court experience speaking about that a lot. One of the other members of the court, Rucha Kadam, talked about how she is a young woman in computer science and the obstacles she's faced because of her gender in that field. Sherry Ma talked about the role of responsible journalism in our world today. And so each of us had a different message that we had developed. But as we went through the experience, I learned a lot about about the legacy and the history of this tradition. And I think what I noticed was that really this is a tradition that hasn't been inclusive of all communities. And I felt that that was important to me. I know from my own childhood how important it was to see people that looked like me in positions of distinction, especially as a young woman. It can be challenging when you look to positions of distinction, you don't see people that look like you. And so I wanted to share those pieces of my identity that you had previously mentioned, and other girls did the same on the court, in order to encourage people from our communities to use their voices and to use the opportunities that they're given to have a significant impact on their community, or to feel that they were included in this tradition that I feel lucky to be a part of.
That's great. So just a couple things with that. First, going back to the history, you said you sort of noticed some things about it that necessarily inclusion wasn't a huge part of that. Were there specific things that you learned about the history that surprised you and that made you realize that you felt called to be a change agent?
Yeah. So a couple smaller anecdotes and then the numbers. There's a room in the tournament house that has photographs of all of the past presidents of the Tournament of Roses. And I was wandering around the tournament house doing my snooping. And I wandered into this room and I was looking at the wall. And I was looking along the lines, they start out in black and white, and then eventually the photos get colored, and then eventually people start to wear clothes like we wear today. And I was looking along the lines, and there were only older white men who had served down the first row, down the second row, down the third row. And I was looking, and the first woman president of the Tournament of Roses was in 2006. The Tournament of Roses, the structure is that presidents get chosen, I think 12 years in advance. And so it makes the is it 7? 8. There we go. He knows better than I do. They get chosen 8 years in advance. And so it makes the organization very slow to change, but I was still shocked to see that the first woman hadn't served until 2006. That felt pretty backwards to me. And so I then began to do more research. The first African-American Rose Queen didn't serve until, let me see, I wrote this down, until 1985, and the first gay president won't serve until 2026. And so I think I felt like an organization that played such a major role in our community, that served as a centerpiece of our community, and that showed what the values of our community were, should be more inclusive, which is why I chose to share these pieces of my identity.
So you talked about the other young women in the court. Did you ever get together as a group and talk about what each of your issues were going to be and gather and sort of have that conversation?
Yeah, we spent a lot of time together, and so one of the key moments for developing our platforms individually was we gave our first speech before the Queen was selected at a dinner just for tournament members. And that was our first public appearance. And so we each developed our platforms in those moments. We had speech classes, speech writing courses, which helped. And then we also just sat around. There's a room in the tournament house called the Queen and Court Room, which is just a bunch of couches and snacks. Right. And so we would sit around there practicing our speeches for one another, quizzing each other. And so that was a moment when we collaborated to figure out what we were going to say. But our messages also continued to develop throughout the experience. And of course, we were visiting organizations a lot of the time that had their own work that they were doing. And so a lot of the time we were visiting as ambassadors to thank people for the work and their commitment to the community. And so we would tailor our messages depending on where we were going.
So as you began to focus on this message of really saying, this is who I am, and bringing out pieces of your identity, what was the reaction of the Tournament of Roses?
I was really lucky to receive incredible support from the Tournament of Roses. I didn't encounter within the tournament any resistance to sharing those pieces of my identity. And to be perfectly honest, I was worried about it at first. And so my main point people at the tournament were the paid tournament members, or the paid employees of the Tournament of Roses. And they were very excited that I was sharing this message. They had been waiting for a long time to see changes like this in the tournament. But then I received overwhelming support from the 1,000 volunteers for the tournament. And so that was really gratifying to me. I think one of the things I was most dissuaded by at first in looking at the organization was that it seemed like it had been stagnant for a very long time. So some of the social progress that we see in our community and our world hadn't extended to the Tournament of Roses. And I think what I found when I shared these pieces of my identity was that people were really willing and excited and receptive to that change.
Yeah, and it occurs to me, like I think about when you talked about the first woman who was president of Tournament of Roses in 1980, what?
The first, 2006.
Yeah, so okay, 26. But even further back, it was one thing to be a trailblazer, incredibly hard. And now you're doing this in an era of social media where it takes so little to be a target. And here you are in a really not just prominent position, but one with so much tradition to it. And those, I don't know, my experience, those tend to be sort of magnets for people who want to hold on to things that are the past. Did you get, first of all, what was sort of the social media response? I mean, I know that Westboro Baptist came to Sequoia High School, which is usually a sign that you're doing something right. And did you, what was sort of the Twitterverse response? What was your response? Did you get any help handling that? What was that experience like?
Yeah, so right before I released an op-ed just before the parade, which was a sort of a formal statement of this message of inclusivity. And before that, I had crafted that statement and worked a lot on what the message what the message was that I was going to share in interviews with both a consultant that's affiliated with the tournament, and then also with a lot of the paid staff at the tournament. And so I had gotten a lot of support from my own family in crafting that message and in developing responses to some of the questions that we anticipated getting. And so I had support in that way, but I think I was pleasantly surprised. I mean, aside from the Westboro thing, and then some people in the comments section of articles or on Twitter, I didn't receive much resistance to the message I was sharing, and that I felt very lucky to have. There was an article in the American Conservative, which was a critique of my position. But to be perfectly honest, the community that I cared about and the community that I was sharing this message for was my local community of Pasadena, and then anyone for whom the Tournament of Roses and this tradition was important. And so among those sectors, I received really only support.
That's wonderful. So what are you learning about yourself through this? It's just extraordinary experience.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I've learned is how I respond to a lot of the public pressure that comes when you put yourself out on the internet, and also in speeches in this way. I think I didn't expect how much of responsibility I would feel, and it certainly felt, especially as time progressed, that I had been given a real opportunity that I needed to make use of. I didn't share these pieces of my identity publicly and formally until rather late in the traditional timeline for the Tournament of Rose, or for the Rose Court position. And so I think as time went on, that responsibility began to weigh on me, and I began to feel more and more like this was something I had to put out there in a formal way. I hadn't hidden it, but I hadn't shared it more publicly. And so that was, I think, what really made me write that op-ed was I felt that I had a responsibility to my community and to the people that were looking to this tradition as a statement of our values to share what my values were.
So just sort of tell us some stories. What's been the most surprising or disturbing or challenging, or what was just the most plain fun that you've had doing this?
Yeah. Let's see. Well, one story is that is when I realized what role the Tournament of Roses has in our community. I was standing in line in Trader Joe's, and if any of you have ever been to Trader Joe's just before dinner time, you know there's that great dinner rush. I'm sorry if any of you have had the misfortune of that. But there are always some crazy incidences. So in this case, on this particular day, there was a race for the pre-peeled carrots, and there was a massive traffic jam in the wine aisle. So I was standing in line observing all of these things, and I got bored at some point, so I started eavesdropping on a conversation of two people behind me. And what I gained was that there were two old acquaintances who had fortuitously met in the line at Trader Joe's, and they were talking. They ran through the normal subjects: work, kids, family, and Donald Trump. And then eventually they one of them remarked, "Oh, have you heard the Rose Queen was just announced?" No. I didn't like that came just after Donald Trump, but it's okay, it's okay. Anyway, so then the other person said, "Oh yeah, she seems very sweet," and well, at that point I stopped listening because the cashier called me up. I know that's anticlimactic, but I think, I think what I realized in that moment was that people really think of the Rose Court as an area of common ground, as sort of a touchstone of the community that reflects the values of that community. And so I think that's one thing that taught me that I had the responsibility that I had this year to define what those values were. Another story, let's see, there's some fun ones. Here's a funny one, which is I was going on, this was just before parade day, I think it was the day before the parade. I was going on to a KTLA interview, and some of you know we wear a crown. And so I was standing outside in the freezing cold, and I realized my crown was crooked, which is, you know, I'm sure you can all relate. Absolutely. And so I asked one of the committee members if he would adjust it for me, and there was so much hairspray in my hair at that point that the crown was pretty stuck on there. So he decided the best way to do it would be to go from the very top, the biggest pearl on the entire crown right in the top center. And he gave a couple tugs, and he gave one particularly aggressive tug, and this pearl went flying into the air vent. So we looked at each other, and we said, "What pearl?" And then I went into the KTLA interview, and he spent the entirety of the interview digging around in the air vent trying to find the pearl. We found it, so it's a good story.
So we don't need to edit that out of the video later, okay.
No. So, of course, there are always funny things that happen when you spend a lot of time with a group of people. We really spent 3 months together with the committee that takes care of us and that helps shepherd us through this process, and then as a court. One of the things that made the experience the most enjoyable was that you spend 3 months with 6 of your best friends. And so that was an experience that was really gratifying. It feels, we're pretty sure we'll all be friends together because it feels like we've gone through an experience that no one could quite understand for this time. Let's see. One more? Do you want one more funny story?
Go.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I was very excited about this Rose Court experience and to take part in the tradition. There was one piece of the tradition that I was perhaps less excited for, which is that each year the Royal Court does a fashion show at Macy's. And for people that know me well, they never thought they'd see me up on a catwalk. But I played along, so we went. They erected a massive catwalk in the Macy's department store in Pasadena, and I went last. And so each of the girls went out before me, and they came off stage one by one and said, "Oh, it was fine. You'll be great." We had 3 outfits. So I was in my first outfit, which was a furry something. I'm not exactly sure what. And I got up there, and I was so nervous that I practically ran down the runway and ran back. And the announcer looked at me, and he took my hand, and he goes, "Let's do it together." And so he walked me down the runway hand in hand a second time, and I couldn't run that time. Yeah.
So one of the things that strikes me, someone did a study years ago and said the number one fear of people in this country was public speaking, and like fear of death came in like 4th. And Jerry Seinfeld used that to say if you're at a funeral, you're better off being in the coffin than giving the eulogy. And so you have you always, you're just like so natural at this. Have you always been comfortable speaking in public? Is this something that you really had to learn and get coached up on? So, you have such a powerful voice. and you claim it so well. Is this something, what's the learning curve been like for that?
So I've always done public speaking, I've done debate, I've done government from a very young age. I think the first real public speaking I ever did was when I had my bat mitzvah. At my temple, you give probably a 10, 15-minute speech in front of the whole congregation. And so that was a pretty transformative experience for me. You had to write an entire speech, which was something I had never done before, which was a painful process. My mother and I spent, well, weeks fighting over that one. But I think getting up there in front of all of my family that had flown in, and then all of the temple community that I had grown up with, and delivering something that I was proud of, that was when I realized that public speaking was something that I cared about and was something that was important to me. And I also realized that the reason that we do public speaking is to share messages with people, and that those words that we share can have real power for people. Not just symbolic power, it can make people feel good, it can make people feel bad, but also the power to make real differences in the world, to change the way people act or behave, or to encourage people to take certain actions that make the world a better place. And so I think that's when I first found public speaking as a tool for affecting the world around me. And then it's a skill I've been working on. I mean, you know, it's something you practice. But I think what I've found is harder than public speaking is knowing what you want to say. And so that's really what I've had to work on. And I found that once you know what you want to say, the public speaking is easy. If you have something you care about, you're more focused on that than everybody else out there in the audience.
Where do you go to temple?
I go to Temple Sinai in Glendale.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. So the moment I knew I really wanted you to be here in the forum is we were over at City Hall, and there was a city council debate about whether we were going to stay on track for the $15 an hour minimum wage. Right. And what happens in, you know, as you know, and as many of you know who've been there, what happens in the time is, you know, person after person after person, you know, stands up. And it's really important because the city council needs to hear all these voices. And the challenge is not just saying the same thing that everyone else is saying. And you have 2 minutes, and it's really hard to say something in 2 minutes, as you know from me. And so, and you got up, and it was, I mean, some of it was, oh, there's the Rose Queen. And, you know, but you owned that space. And you were so compelling in that 2 minutes. And that's where I thought, oh, wow, I've got to get you here for this conversation. And, you know, but that was a different thing. That was a choice you made to use your voice for that specific issue. And you used it incredibly well. So where do you see this leading you? Where do you find yourself drawn to use your voice now?
So the way the minimum wage one happened was I was contacted by Peter Dreyer from Pasadena, Pasadenians Organizing for Progress.
Yeah, right, that's it.
And he said there was this issue that I might be interested in looking at, and that it was one that was important to many of the communities that I had spoken to throughout this experience. And so I did my research. He sent me the report he was creating, and then I read the report from the economists who had done a review of this issue, and I thought it was something that was important for this community that I'm part of. To be, you know, in perfect honesty, I wrote a 2-minute speech and then was only given 1 minute. So that wasn't my proudest moment, but
no, you did great.
But I think that it's been important to me to say things that will be important to people and that will make the community a safer place for more groups of people. And so that was why I chose to do that. I honestly don't know where this experience will lead me next. The Rose Court experience has given me many wonderful connections that will be valuable for my future. I've met an enormous number of scientists that have given me their business cards and said, contact me when you're, you know, when you're ready. And so there are those connections that I will treasure going forward. And then there are, of course, the skills I've gained from this experience. And just the sheer number of people I've met. But then the other thing is that I think it's taught me that it's important to commit your time to things that really feel valuable to you. And so I hope that I will continue to make those choices going forward. My guess is that I'll be doing science in the future.
Yeah. That's great. You have someone take those microphones there, Kimberly, and you have a couple people who can grab those. And I want to just open it up to you all for some questions for Louise. There's Patty. So, yeah, and please say your name.
Hi, I'm Becky Nicolaitis, embarrassing my daughter to my right. I'm just so inspired by you. You're really an amazing person, and especially just the strength and positivity that you just exude. It's really inspiring. So I just have to ask you, in this day where we're dealing with this with our kids, with social media, the negativity that is just all over that, can you just talk a little more about how you rolled that off your back? I mean, I just was wondering if you had any advice about that. When people are saying mean things, and which you've had a share of, and you seem to have really handled it with a lot of grace and strength. I just wanted to know if you had anything else you might say about that.
Yeah, no, it's such an important question, and I know for me and for many of my friends, social media has played an increasingly large role in our lives as we've grown up. I will say the first thing that makes it manageable at all is the support I have from my community and my family, like the real connections that I have in the real world that are outside entirely of technology. And so those have been incredible outlets for me, my family, my school, my friends. The other thing I'll say is that you're allowed, one of the things that social media gives you is that it allows you to choose the circles that you want to be part of. And so it's been important for me to follow accounts that make me feel good about myself, to follow my friends, and to allow people to follow me that are positive and supportive role models for me. And then to try to be that for other people. I think there's a lot of temptation, especially on social media, to compare yourself to other people or to be competitive about the ways that you're engaging on social media. And I think that's something that my friends and I don't engage in, and that we don't encourage within our communities. But it's difficult, I will say. It's certainly difficult, especially as a young woman, you feel those pressures to look a certain way, to act a certain way, to be doing certain things at certain times. And so I think really it's making sure you're engaged and focused on things that matter to you, and identifying what those things are so that the other things just don't feel particularly consequential. Yeah.
Thank you. Over there, Phoebe? Or Phoebe, Patty, right behind you was Phoebe Kellogg, who had, yeah.
Hi. Okay, so I know it doesn't seem like you're human or a teenager at all, but I'm sure that you must be to be the Rose Queen. So as a teenager, we mess up a lot, and a lot of the times it's public. So I just wanted to ask you, when you have moments when things aren't perfect or it doesn't go the way that you were hoping that it would, what are you able to do in this public position and possibly in a public situation to assuage yourself and calm things down a little bit?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I'm certainly human, and I'm certainly a teenager. Let's see. I mean, I can share, first of all, a couple experiences where I've done very poorly. I spoke before the Alhambra Chamber of Commerce, got up and gave the worst speech of my life. And one of the things that helped me in that moment was to see the 6 other young women get up and give really killer speeches. So I knew at least the Rose Court was represented in the right way, even if I couldn't do it. And then I will say also that people don't remember. People what people remember is the way you carry yourself and the way you interact with them one-on-one. People don't really remember what you say in any given speech. And so there's no one incident that matters enough to feel terrible about it for a long time. The other thing I do is that after I give a speech, I take notes on what I did wrong. And I think about what I want to do better for the next time. If I gave an answer that came out the wrong way, I think about how I would rephrase it the next time so that the next time I'm asked that question, I say it the right way. And so I think that makes it productive. Yeah, but everybody feels embarrassment, and everybody messes up.
Do you have any siblings?
I do. I have a younger brother.
So I would imagine there's nothing like a younger brother to remind you that you're not just the Rose Queen.
Oh, yeah. Or parents. They
Or
do
parents,
that too.
yeah.
I'm not the
So-
Rose Queen at home.
Yeah. So that's good. So we're up.
Yeah,
Nancy. And
I have
then-
a. Is this on?
It's on.
It is on. No, it isn't.
Give her a hand. It's on. It's on.
Hello, test.
It's on.
I'm Nancy Mackey, and I'm one of your hundreds of thousands of admirers. I wonder if you would talk about a couple of those values that you want to convey in all these platforms you have. What are the most important ones?
Yeah. So one, I think the overarching value that I chose to talk about this year was inclusivity. And one of the pieces of that is welcoming and supporting people that aren't like yourself. So this year, while I was the Rose Queen, there were a number of shootings at Jewish synagogues, and then now there was the one at the mosque. And so I think that throughout those, each time I would go to an event that was just after one of those, I would hold a moment of silence. Most of the time, I was in a room with not one Jewish person. Most of the time, I was in a room where not one person could identify or had even had friends that were Jewish. And so a lot of the time, it was about encouraging people to empathize and to connect with people that didn't share common identities. And so I think that was something that I chose to emphasize this year. The other value or piece of this that I advocated for was talking about the value of tradition in our communities and then the way those traditions change. I think often there's a tendency, especially among my generation, to dismiss traditions as old-fashioned and to move on without consideration, to think that the traditions are necessarily wrong or necessarily something to be dismissed. And I think one of the things I've learned throughout this Rose Court experience is that those traditions are really valuable because they root us and they connect us to a community that can really serve us, especially in times of tragedy or in times of opposition. And so I wanted this year to make sure that people were felt supported by that tradition. The Tournament of Roses is a tradition that's been around for an incredibly long time, and it's one that plays a significant role not just on New Year's Day, when 44 million people watch the Rose Parade and feel the excitement of a new year and a new beginning, but it's one that plays a significant role year-round in uniting our community and in carrying out the values of that community, of inclusivity, of kindness, of compassion, and really of community service. The Tournament of Roses is run by volunteers. There are only 35 paid members that run this organization, and all of the rest of the work is done by volunteers. And so it's one that embodies the value of community service and of servanthood that I think is a value of Pasadena and is really important in our world today.
I'm just curious, how many people in here have volunteered for Tournament of Roses? Yeah, we've got quite a few. Yeah, it's really big. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Margie. How does where on your college application did you put Rose Queen? And how has I'm sure you've already been accepted places. So what are your college plans?
Yeah. So I'm going to the University of Chicago next year. Thanks. And I think it depended on the school. So for the UCs, I definitely put it toward the top. And then for most of my application was centered around my work in science. So I put my research above my Rose Court experience, which, seems so silly. But yeah, you have to make a choice. So yeah.
What's some of your research?
Yeah, so the two main research experiences I've had 2 summers ago, and then it continued throughout up until last summer. I worked at NASA Ames doing space biology research. We were looking at the reduced rate of drug metabolism in spaceflight, so looking at why when people are sent up to space and they ingest drugs, why those are metabolized at a slower rate and why they're less effective. And so we were looking at the effect that microgravity has on drug metabolism. And then the other research I'm doing right now is at Charles Drew University, which is a minority institution in Compton. And we're looking at health disparities, so trying to understand why African American with triple-negative breast cancer have a higher mortality rate than Caucasian women.
What are you finding? Or is there anything conclusive yet?
Yeah, we're writing a study right now. It's just being edited. And we found that a lot of different things, there's a pro-inflammatory response that has a significant effect. There are socioeconomic factors that have an effect, but we've also found that the reason that African American women have a higher mortality rate with triple-negative breast cancer is not only due to socioeconomic factors, it's a biological difference, which is an interesting finding and might not necessarily foreseen.
That's great. Yeah. We got one down here. Who else? We got Bob here. Anyone else? Yeah, go ahead, here.
You talked about the grand and somewhat glorious tradition of the tournament. You also made a reference to the very dark history of that place, and you did obviously take some time to look at that. And there's been a progression, whether it's extremely slow progression. For me, they'll never be forgiven for never making Jackie Robinson the marshal of the parade. Admirals and generals and Republican politicians always were the marshals for years and years and years. So Mike, I have 2 questions, and they're probably extremely difficult to answer in any short period of time. But one is, do you have any feel at all for what brought about the change over a long, slow period from an old white men organization to a much more progressive organization today? Were there individuals? Was there a struggle? There's a story there that ought to be told. And then the second one is, I don't want to put it in terms of reparations, but what more do you think the tournament ought to do to be of service and to be helpful to a city of Pasadena, which still is divided into 2 cities? And your friend Peter Dreyer, whom you referred to, writes about it and speaks about it. Yeah. And it's a huge question, I recognize that, and maybe only time for a few comments. But anyway.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I'll answer the first part first, which is the Tournament of Roses has had to reconcile itself. It began out of the Valley Hunt Club, which is a very white, very wealthy organization. And so it has had a long history of discrimination, as you say. And it has obviously been slow to change. I mean, we recognize that simply looking at the leadership of the organization. I think it has also began to extend itself to communities that it has not traditionally represented. And the court has progressively become more and more diverse, and the leadership of the tournament has very slowly become more and more diverse. And so I think one of the pressures, I don't know if there's one particular tipping point or one moment that I can point to, but I will say that one of the reasons that it has been changing is that the community has been vocal, the community has insisted that that change is necessary, and that change is important. For an organization to survive as a representation of our community and as something that unites this community, it must represent all of that community. And so it has taken people that are willing to be the first to make that organization change, and then it has taken every person that follows. We're only on our 3rd female president this upcoming year. And so each successive person that is willing to be part of this organization and that sets themselves up in order to lead the organization makes it one that is more inclusive and that is able to represent more of the community. Your second question.
Any thoughts on where the tournament ought to go
Right.
to be more inclusive, more helpful, to help unify the community?
Yeah. So one of the things about the Tournament of Roses is that it has enormous economic power. There's a lot of money in the tournament because of the football game, and so the tournament has a division which is using some of that money for charitable work in the community, and I think it should and will continue to use more of that budget in order to serve members of the community.
Great, thank you. We're at 11 now. Thank you so much for being with us. Can we please express our appreciation?